What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you an overview of the Druid and Necromancer as part of the Diablo 4 beta, which is currently in its open beta period, where everyone could jump in over the weekend to check the game out for themselves, though unlike the closed beta period, this particular one had the Druid and Necromancer available, so I thought I would take a look at both these classes as they were the ones that I primarily wanted to play, and give people some information about them. Though it is worth mentioning at the beginning here to remember that this is a beta, and while we are unlikely to see major changes to these classes, things like numbers and exact balancing could very much so change, especially since this beta covered basically the early game period, which will likely be radically different from where people end up. But with all of that said, let's actually dive into this and talk about the Druid first. The Druid is making its return from Diablo 2, and in many ways, a lot of that carried forward. Much of the skills and things like that are just direct translations. In fact, many of the builds are available here, obviously in slightly different forms, but the core of what the Druid will be doing is shape-shifting either into a werewolf or werebear, or casting elemental spells, usually wind or earth, occasionally with some lightning mixed in. Though one thing about the Druid in particular I want to highlight with this overview is that mixing and matching a lot of their skills makes everything feel very clunky, and as a result, I would definitely lean into either one shape-shifting aspect, either werewolf or werebear, or a casting aspect. And on the casting side, you're likely to still run into some problems that we're going to get into. But at a base level, much like all the other classes, every tier of their skill tree gives them unlocks, these being your basic attack, which is your generator for spirit, which serves as our class resources. Then we move on to our core skill or our main damage skill, before moving on to more situational stuff, such as companions or larger attacks with cooldowns, that kind of thing. But many of these skills that occupy a particular type are seemingly designed to work together. For instance, if you want to play as a werewolf, you definitely want to grab all of the werewolf skills as they all kind of complement each other, which is much the same with the nature magic, etc. Now, on the shape-shifting side, that winds up feeling really good, albeit a little slow because melee doesn't have a ton going on here in the early game. However, the werewolf can potentially lean into attack speed and multiple attacks based on a percentage chance, or they can lean into more poisoned-based damage via spreading disease. So even within these sort of archetypes, you still have some options to play around with, and because of that, the shape-shifting side of things feels very cohesive. Though it is worth mentioning that unlike Diablo 2, you do not spend most of your time as a werewolf, but rather werewolf skills will temporarily turn you into one, and then after a while of not using a werewolf skill, you'll change back, or a werebear, vice versa. Now, there are some mechanics that directly relate to changing into different forms, such as being a werewolf for so long, or going from werewolf to werebear, etc. And in addition to this, regardless of your build, everyone will get access to companions via either a vine creeper, wolves, or the ravens, all of which have an active ability as well as just accompanying you passively simply by having the skill on your bar, and those feel great and integrate with all of the builds you can play around here with very well. Now, on the flip side of things, the Druid can also cast spells, but I think this is where the class falls apart a little bit. Where the shape-shifting can feel cohesive if a little slow at times, the casting just feels a little bit off, and I think this is largely down to the high resource costs combined with the cooldowns on the skills. So there are wind or lightning or earth spells. The wind and lightning is big on damage, whereas the earth stuff goes a little more crowd control and defense. More or less what you would expect. However, many of these skills either have very high resource costs and not an amount of damage that seems to really go in line with that, or they have a cooldown that means you can only use them so often, so you wind up feeling like a very weak melee character or just spamming little wind blasts at people. So on the wind side of things, it really does feel like a worse version of either a sorcerer or a barbarian. And as far as a beta goes, I really hope they kind of redo some of this because the caster version of the Druid just does not feel good. And while the earth side of that does feel a little better, it still runs into the same problem. And it seems like a lot of the spells specifically have a bit of a cohesion problem where a lot of the resource costs versus the damage output just don't make any sense, and then you have cooldowns you have to work around, and it just winds up feeling very unfun, I would say. Though the shape-shifting side of things is pretty cool. Now, before we wrap up talking about the Druid, I wanted to talk about their sort of class feature, which is unfortunately not really available in the beta, and who knows, maybe this will address some of the issues. But at level 15, you'll be directed to an area that is inaccessible in the beta, where you can start presenting druidic offerings that start dropping off of enemies to various spirits who are then supposed to grant you a boon. However, I can't verify what any of these are or do, simply because they are not available. So, to wrap up the Druid section, overall I really enjoyed the shape-shifting. I thought that was fun. There's a few different builds you could go for here, with Werebear, Werewolf shifting back and forth potentially, and even within each of those shapeshift forms there's individual builds you could shoot for, and I think that part feels good, but the caster side really needs some work. Now, on the Necromancer side of things, we have a very different story. The Necromancer is ridiculous in the early game. It is incredibly strong, and a lot of that comes down to its class feature of the Book of the Dead, which is where we're going to start. You see, skill-wise, the Necromancer doesn't have quite as much to choose from in terms of active skills. Rather, they have a lot of passive skills on their skill tree, but nonetheless, they can pick from things like blood, bone, summoning, the usual stuff. There's some curses. However, every Necromancer has access to summoning for free. They don't have to spend any skill points on it. Right away, you can summon up to 4 skeleton minions, and then as you level up, you can change the type of skeletal warrior that you are getting, either to something more defensive or a high damage Reaper version, and you can even upgrade these skeletons as well. You can choose between one boon or another, or you can choose not to be able to summon them at all and return for a buff of some kind. However, the Raise Skeleton skill button is shared with Raise Skeletal Mages, which you get access to at level 15 for free, at which point you can summon 3 skeletal mages with the same skill that you can use to summon the skeletons. And keep in mind, you didn't have to spend any skill points at all on this. So you can use your actual skill points to get very high damage, no resource cost skills to then destroy enemies with. So while the Necromancer has a resource called Essence that they have to build and use on their main damage skills, they do also have a variety of damaging abilities that don't actually use any resource at all, besides technically corpses, because the Necromancer, upon killing things, will drop corpses, which is how they resurrect their skeletons, and some of the skills, rather than cost essence, cost corpses. However, that's not a real resource cost, plus the Necromancer's resource regenerates naturally over time, so it's easy to just never really run out of it. And then you combine that with a lot of these skills being very high damage, like Bone Spear. I found that what was really effective here in the early game for a Necromancer was to simply have all of these summons up that you're going to get for free outside of a single slot on your skill bar before you get the Golem at level 25. High damage, low resource cost Bone Spear to one-shot several enemies in a group, and then use Corpse Explosion to blow everyone up, which has no cooldown and can be spammed. And just those 2 skills were usually able to just walk me through the entire game with basically no gear. Most of what I had on was like blues, because despite the increased legendary drop rate, I couldn't get anything for the Necromancer here. And honestly, the damage was so high I didn't really need it. And all of that is to say nothing of the Necromancer's other skills, such as their curses. You can use things like Decrepify to just take 20% damage off of what enemies are capable of dealing to you, while at the same time slowing them potentially. So while the Druid felt a little underbaked, the Necromancer is kind of the problem in the opposite direction. Everything they could do was just way over the top. Though, to be fair, that does make them very fun to play, but I would be surprised if we don't see some sort of balancing here, because them getting all of these upgrades to summoning on top of their regular skill points just has them leaps and bounds ahead of every other class at these early levels, and while that might balance out at the end game, here in the early game, it's like playing a different game from everyone else. Plus, due to the nature of a lot of their skills, they are able to be mixed and matched a little better, I would say. Many of them are ranged projectiles or ranged AoEs, and because of this, a lot of them are decently interchangeable, while making sure to retain the classics everyone was looking for, such as Corpse Explosion. Though, at the same time, I will say say the Necromancer, while definitely fulfilling that class fantasy, does feel a little less diverse in terms of the skills and builds that were available to you, which is largely down to the paring down of active skills on the skill tree compared to the other classes, which is something to keep in mind, certainly, though given the popularity of the Necromancer class, I don't think most people will care. But to kind of wrap this video up and leave you guys with it, the Druid, the shapeshifting felt really great. The casting side I think needs some work, or we at least need to see how it functions in-game for a concrete opinion, because early game it just does not feel good. And then the Necromancer is sort of the opposite end of that, with you feeling very powerful while having done very little, though certainly lacking in the options available to other classes as they are getting their summons for free, which is part of why they are so powerful. But that is all I've got for you guys today. I certainly hope you enjoyed the look at these two classes, and with this being open beta, some of you may have tried them out for yourself. I'd love to hear about it down in the comments section below, but for those who are unable to play this weekend, I certainly hope you found the video informative. But regardless of all that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.